Well, we have made our way here to the end of October. It's hard to imagine, right? But usually about this time, the end of October, lots of Protestant traditions take time to honor the Reformation, and the last Sunday in October is often called Reformation Sunday. Now, that's not something that maybe folks in the United Church of Christ spend as much time celebrating as maybe the Lutheran tradition or the Reformed tradition, but I think it's important for us to mention. We probably wouldn't be doing church the way that we do church if it weren't for the reformers. So let's put in place some historical things that happened just before the Reformation and the early Reformation ideas. First of all, let's talk about Gutenberg a little bit. I don't know if the Reformation would have happened had the printing press not been invented. It changed lots of things for church, for the Roman Catholic tradition. When it was invented in the mid-1400s, this idea that people would actually have books in their hands, that they would not only be in the hands of a priest, that there would be missals created and people would be following along in a new and a different way in worship. That all happened mid-1400s, which then in the early 1500s, in 1517, is when Luther wrote those 95 Theses and hammered them up, supposedly, on the door of that church. And I think it's important to think in the context of things too. He didn't want a new branch of the church to begin. He just wanted changes within. He was a priest. He was a monk, and he just grew in his spirituality and in his faith to find that there were problems, things he could no longer stand within the traditions of the Roman Catholic Church. And so his lists were a list of complaints about how we did worship at that point, how we were the church, what traditions had developed that he believed took people away from Scripture, from the Bible. And he asked for people to reconsider their theology about who is God, what is God. And then there were other voices too, a couple of voices that came up and out of Switzerland. I know the Congregational kind of strain of who we are thinks about Ulrich Zwingli, who also was a poet and wrote some hymns just like Luther. The interesting thing I think about for us to consider about Ulrich Zwingli are a couple of things. First of all, he was the one that said, why do we fast during Lent, and why is it that priests can't marry? And so he was married, and he was in Zurich, Switzerland, and he set about ripples all over the place with what he did. But he had the plague, and he survived the plague, and he wrote about it all the way through his process of having it and also his process of recovery. But he did die. And I think a piece of the Reformation era that we don't talk about a lot is the fact that there were battles, actual military battles of Reformed Protestant military against Catholic military. Ulrich Zwingli went out onto the battlefield to try and stop it, and he was killed. So he then turned, of course, into a martyr for that Reformation era. And then, of course, John Calvin, a French reformer, who left France, I think had to leave France, and spent some time in Switzerland. Also, I think might have gotten kicked out of Geneva, Switzerland for his beliefs as well. So there were exiles, there was this military element to the Reformation, and yet here we are, over 500 years later, still keeping that Protestant Reformed Reformation tradition alive in who we are. So, Ein feste Burg, one of the very most well-known hymns written by Martin Luther. It was, in fact, in the time, the battle hymn of the Reformation. So this would be sung out on the streets. This would be sung during those battles that I talked about. But I think it's also important to know that it's scripture. it is Psalm 46, set to music. That also is interesting for me to think about. That up and out of Scripture can come a battle cry. So is that what it sounds like to you when you hear it today? So remember, this is what it sounds like, right? In your heart and soul. But this is the first verse of A Mighty Fortress is Our God. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing, our present help amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing. For still our ancient foe doth seek to work us woe with craft and power great, and armed with cruel hate, on earth without an equal. Ein Festburg, written by Martin Luther. I think it's important in this time for us also to think about, how is the church reforming today? How are we keeping that spirit of analysis of what it is we are when we worship? What is worship about today? Since we've had to change it so significantly. And what is our theology today? Do we ever get the chance to assess and analyze and wonder about that? That is what keeps the Reformer's spirit alive for us. And I think the church is called to do that as part of carrying on the tradition of being brave and being bold and courageous and asking questions. So may this celebration of the Reformation help your heart and help your faith grow this day. Play this, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. Play it a couple of times. Sing along. Thank you for joining me in this music moment.